On the surface, the Menendez family embodied the American dream. Their sprawling Beverly Hills mansion, with its manicured lawns and white-pillared entrance, seemed like a page torn from a glossy lifestyle magazine. The father, José Menendez, was the symbol of hard-earned success, a Cuban immigrant who had clawed his way from nothing to become a wealthy entertainment executive in Hollywood. He was sharp, ambitious, and relentless. In his world, there was no room for weakness, no tolerance for failure. Beside him was his wife, Mary Louise Kitty Menendez, a woman once full of charm and grace. She had grown up in Illinois, vibrant and ambitious, with dreams of her own before marrying José. But over the years, her glow dimmed, leaving her dependent, fragile, and, according to many who knew her, quietly drowning under the weight of her husband's control. From the outside, their two sons seemed destined for privilege and opportunity. Lyle, the eldest, had the swagger and confidence of a leader. He attended Princeton briefly, though never quite fit into the academic mold. Erik, 3 years younger, was shy, soft-spoken, and yet surprisingly talented on the tennis court. Together, the brothers lived in a world most could only dream of: private schools, country clubs, and expensive vacations. Yet, behind the gates of their mansion, that dream carried a darker shadow. Those close to the family spoke later of a house ruled by fear rather than warmth, expectations rather than affection. The brothers were under constant pressure, to succeed, to obey, and above all, to preserve the family's polished image. What neighbors and acquaintances didn't see was the undercurrent of tension running through the Menendez household. José was known to be domineering, a man who demanded absolute control not just in his career, but in his family life. Friends described Kitty as emotionally unstable, often medicated, prone to mood swings that left the boys walking on eggshells. The image of the perfect Beverly Hills family began to fracture the closer one looked. In fact, former classmates of Erik later remembered a nervous, easily rattled teenager who carried a weight that didn't match his age. Lyle, more outspoken, often stepped into a protective role, though some saw him as aggressive, even arrogant. It was in this environment that the seeds of something unthinkable were planted. Behind the designer suits, the expensive cars, and the mansion's marble floors, there was constant tension. By the late 1980s, that tension had grown unbearable. Yet no one in their social circles could have predicted just how violently it would explode. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you have to first understand José's obsession with perfection. His rise from a poor Cuban immigrant to a millionaire executive wasn't just impressive, it was ruthless. He pushed his sons in the same way he had pushed himself, relentlessly, with no room for mistakes. Erik's tennis career, for example, wasn't just a pastime, it was an expectation. When he lost matches, he didn't just face disappointment, he faced rage. For José, family wasn't about love, it was about legacy. For Kitty, the role of perfect wife and mother was something she could no longer live up to, and over the years, she slipped further into despair. But it wasn't only pressure and control. The defense, years later, would reveal something far darker: accusations of sexual and emotional abuse at the hands of José. These claims would divide America. Some believed them, others dismissed them as lies concocted by the brothers to escape punishment. Before the murders and trials, those allegations linger like a silent shadow, unspoken, but present. Erik, by his own account, confided in his brother about what he claimed their father was doing to him. Lyle, protective yet torn, allegedly promised that one day he would stop it. Whether you believe those accounts or not, they remain at the very heart of this story, and you can't talk about the Menendez family without acknowledging the possibility that behind those walls, something deeply sinister was taking place. Still, in public, the Menendez family smiled for photographs, attended social gatherings, and maintained the illusion of wealth and happiness. Kitty hosted lavish parties, José made powerful connections in Hollywood. The family rubbed shoulders with celebrities, blending into the glittering lifestyle of late 1980s Los Angeles. But insiders noticed Kitty's increasing instability. Friends described her as anxious, heavily drinking, sometimes ranting about her failing marriage. The once glamorous hostess was unraveling, and her sons knew it all too well. They lived with her moods, her despair, and their father's authoritarian hand. Together, those forces created a powder keg, one waiting for a spark. That spark, as we'll know later in the story, would ignite on the night of August 20th, 1989. But long before that night, the stage had already been set. Lyle and Erik were not the golden sons they appeared to be. Erik, though quiet, was fragile, and he carried secrets that weighed heavily on his young shoulders. Lyle, though brash, was fiercely protective of his brother, and in his own way, desperate to prove himself outside the shadow of their father. Kitty, meanwhile, was retreating further into a haze of depression, unable to protect her sons from the man who ruled their household. And José? He was focused on his empire, on his money, on the image of control. What none of them seemed to notice was that control was slipping. By the summer of 1989, things were reaching a boiling point. Erik was struggling with tennis, fearing his father's wrath. Lyle was floundering academically, unable to live up to Princeton's demands. Kitty, increasingly volatile, was speaking openly to friends about wanting to leave. And José, perhaps sensing the cracks, was reportedly tightening his grip even harder. The Menendez mansion, for all its luxury, had become a pressure chamber. And inside were two young men who felt trapped, desperate, and, whether out of fear, resentment, or rage, ready to break free. The Menendez brothers' story doesn't begin with the sound of gunshots. It begins with a dream, the kind of dream millions of immigrants have chased: success, wealth, and security. But for the Menendez family, that dream twisted into a nightmare. And in the glittering streets of Beverly Hills, where appearances mean everything, the truth was carefully hidden until it exploded in the most shocking way imaginable. Erik, the younger brother, was only 18 at the time of the murders. By then, he was a sensitive, awkward young man whose passion for tennis was both an escape and a source of pain. From a young age, Erik had been pushed relentlessly by his father. Tennis lessons, strict schedules, endless practice hours, it was José's dream, not Erik's. Former coaches recalled how the boy seemed scared of losing, not because defeat hurt him personally, but because of how his father would react. To lose wasn't just a loss, it was shame. That shame, according to Erik, was compounded by something far darker: the alleged abuse he endured, abuse he would later testify about in haunting detail. According to Erik, his childhood had been stolen from him, replaced by fear. Whether one believes those claims or not, they became the cornerstone of his defense, and the deepest scar in his life. Lyle, at 21, had a different role. He was louder, bolder, more willing to challenge authority, though still caught in his father's orbit. Friends recalled him as cocky, sometimes arrogant, a young man who wore his wealth on his sleeve. But beneath that image, there was something else, a protective instinct toward his brother. Erik trusted Lyle enough to confide in him about what he claimed their father was doing. When Erik told him, Lyle's response wasn't disbelief, it was fury. He swore to his younger brother that he would stop it, that one day the cycle would end. That moment, brother protecting brother, would become a pivotal part of their story, because it transformed the secret shame into a shared burden. It gave the brothers a silent pact, one that would eventually erupt into tragedy. Kitty, meanwhile, was crumbling. Once elegant and strong, she had descended into alcoholism and dependency on tranquilizers. Friends saw her as increasingly unstable, a woman who both loved her sons and lashed out at them. Erik described her later as a mother who looked away when things were happening in the house. Others said she was too weak to intervene, that she lived in fear of José as much as her sons did. There were nights when Kitty reportedly confided to friends about her failing marriage, about wanting to leave. But she never did. Instead, she stayed in the mansion, medicated, her mood swinging from warmth to hostility, leaving her sons confused and unprotected. The late 1980s were especially turbulent for the family. Lyle had tried Princeton but dropped out, unable to cope with the academic demands and his father's high expectations. José, furious, called his son a failure. Erik, meanwhile, was struggling with tennis. Each match brought him closer to a breakdown, knowing that losing meant shame at home. The boys felt trapped. They were old enough to see the dysfunction, yet too dependent to escape it. In their minds, the mansion was no longer a home, it was a cage. The abuse allegations, which exploded in the courtroom years later, were kept hidden during this time. But if you listen to Erik's testimony, you can imagine what those nights felt like. A boy terrified of his father, silenced by fear, clinging only to his older brother for protection. And if you listen to the prosecution, you hear a different version, two spoiled sons exaggerating or inventing abuse to excuse what was really about money and greed. This duality, victims or murderers, has always been at the core of the Menendez case. But in 1988 and 1989, before any jury, before any cameras, all that mattered was that two young men were living in a home they believed had become unbearable. It was during this period that the brothers began talking more openly to each other about their fears. Erik confided his darkest secrets, and Lyle, furious and protective, told him something chilling: "One day, we'll have to stop him." That statement, whether a promise or a threat, marked a turning point. It showed that the boys were no longer just surviving. They were imagining escape, even if it meant something drastic. The evening of August 20, 1989, began like so many others in the Menendez household. The massive Beverly Hills mansion stood silent under the warm California night, its lights glowing softly against the darkness. Inside, José and Kitty Menendez had settled into their den, a cozy space where they often watched television together. They sat on separate couches, as they usually did. José leaned back, remote in hand, commanding the room even in relaxation. Kitty, wearing her comfortable nightclothes, seemed restless, occasionally glancing toward her husband. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was an ordinary Sunday night in a wealthy home. But for their sons, Lyle and Erik, it was the night everything would change. Earlier that day, the brothers had attended a local movie theater, buying tickets for Batman as a way to establish an alibi. Yet their nerves betrayed them. Friends would later testify that the brothers had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the murders, jittery, tense, distracted. That night, instead of immersing themselves in a movie, they were planning the unthinkable. By the time they returned home, their decision was already made. They were armed with two 12-gauge shotguns, weapons they had purchased days earlier from a San Diego sporting goods store. They had practiced with them, prepared for this moment. Now, the weapons lay heavy in their hands as they crept toward the den. What happened next was brutal and swift. At approximately 10 p.m., the brothers entered the den where their parents sat watching TV. Without hesitation, Lyle raised his shotgun and fired directly at his father. The blast struck José in the head, killing him instantly. The sound was deafening, echoing through the mansion's halls. Kitty screamed, a piercing cry of terror, and tried to scramble to her feet. But Erik, panicked and shaking, fired his weapon at her. The shot hit, but it wasn't fatal. Kitty collapsed, bloodied, and in desperation, she began to crawl across the floor, leaving a trail behind her. Her screams filled the room, a horrifying plea for her life. The brothers didn't stop. Lyle fired again, and then again. Kitty was struck multiple times, her body jerking with each shot. By the time it was over, she had been shot in the chest, arm, and face. The brutality shocked even seasoned investigators later. The sheer number of wounds showed not just intent, but rage. When silence finally fell, José and Kitty lay lifeless on the floor of their den. The perfect image of the Menendez family had been shattered in an eruption of violence. For a few moments, the house was still, except for the brothers' ragged breathing. The reality of what they had done hung heavy in the air. They had crossed a line that could never be undone. But instead of breaking down or fleeing in panic, Lyle and Erik moved into the second stage of their plan: deception. They cleaned themselves up, got rid of the shotgun shells, and drove away from the mansion. Their plan was to return later and discover the crime scene as if they had no idea what had happened. Around 11:47 p.m., a call came into 911 from Lyle Menendez. His voice, frantic and high-pitched, screamed into the phone, "Somebody killed my parents." The operator tried to calm him as Lyle sobbed and wailed. Erik's cries could be heard faintly in the background. When police arrived, they found the brothers outside the mansion, distraught and shaking. To the officers on the scene, it looked like the worst night of these young men's lives, the night they had lost both parents in a brutal home invasion. Inside the den, the bodies of José and Kitty painted a scene of chaos and horror. Blood spattered the walls, shell casings littered the floor, and the smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. The crime scene, however, raised immediate questions. If this had been a robbery gone wrong, why was the home untouched? Jewelry, cash, and valuables lay in plain sight. The only thing missing, at first glance, was the lives of José and Kitty. Still, detectives initially considered the possibility of a mob-style hit, given José's business connections. The brutality, the close-range shots, the overkill, it had all the hallmarks of an execution. But as investigators looked at the two surviving sons, they saw something else, grief that felt oddly rehearsed. For the next few days, Lyle and Erik played the role of grieving sons. They wept publicly, accepted condolences, and clung to each other. Yet beneath that grief, cracks began to show. Almost immediately after the funerals, the brothers began spending enormous amounts of money. Lyle bought a Rolex watch, a Porsche, and a restaurant in Princeton. Erik hired a personal tennis coach, bought luxury clothes, and traveled lavishly. Within weeks, they had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of their inheritance. To detectives, it was a glaring red flag. Who responds to the violent murder of their parents with shopping sprees? But in those first crucial hours after the crime, the brothers had succeeded in their initial goal. They were seen as victims, not suspects. Police canvassed the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen strange cars or suspicious figures. They explored José's business dealings, wondering if rivals might have ordered a hit. Meanwhile, Lyle and Erik stayed close to home, their grief a performance carefully staged. Yet behind closed doors, they must have felt the weight of what they had done pressing down on them. The murder itself was over, but the story, the real story, was just beginning. What makes the night of August 20th so haunting isn't just the violence of it, but the cold precision. These were not impulsive killings. The brothers had bought the guns, planned the timing, rehearsed their alibi. And when the moment came, they executed it with a chilling mix of fear and rage. Their father died instantly, their mother died in terror. And the two boys who did it would spend the next months pretending they were innocent, hoping no one would see through the cracks. But of course, someone would. And when the truth emerged, it would shock not just Beverly Hills, but the entire nation. Because the story of two sons who murdered their parents was more than just another crime, it was a mirror held up to America, forcing people to ask, what could drive children raised in privilege to commit such an act? Greed? Hatred? Or something darker, hidden within the walls of a mansion that looked so perfect from the outside? In the days following the murders, the Menendez brothers were cast as grieving sons. The funerals for José and Kitty were somber, filled with Hollywood executives, neighbors, and acquaintances stunned by the brutality of the crime. The boys sat in the front pew, dressed in black, tears streaking their faces. They clung to each other, whispered softly, and played their parts convincingly. To most who saw them, it was the picture of tragedy, two young men suddenly orphaned in the most horrifying way. But behind the tears, something else was happening, something that would unravel their story piece by piece. Just days after laying their parents to rest, Lyle and Erik began spending money at a pace that raised eyebrows. In less than 6 months, the brothers burned through nearly $700,000 of their inheritance. Lyle bought a Rolex watch, luxury clothes, and a Porsche Carrera. He invested in a Princeton restaurant, eager to craft the image of a successful businessman. Erik, quieter but no less extravagant, hired a personal tennis coach, bought expensive suits, and indulged in shopping sprees. Together, they traveled, stayed in luxury hotels, and lived like celebrities. For two sons supposedly devastated by grief, their behavior seemed odd, if not suspicious. Detectives noticed. At first, investigators had considered other theories: a mob hit, a business dispute, even a burglary gone wrong. But as days turned into weeks, no evidence supported those leads. José's associates were questioned, but nothing tied them to the murders. Valuables in the house were untouched: jewelry, electronics, even Kitty's prized possessions. The robbery theory collapsed under its own weight. And all the while, the brothers were flaunting their newfound wealth, driving their Porsche down Rodeo Drive, eating at fine restaurants, and spending without restraint. The police began to wonder, were they grieving sons, or killers hiding in plain sight? The cracks deepened when detectives looked closer at the brothers' stories. On the night of the murders, Lyle had placed that frantic 911 call, sobbing that someone had killed his parents. But neighbors reported hearing no intruders, no cars speeding away. Security in the neighborhood made it nearly impossible for strangers to enter unnoticed. And then there was the sheer brutality of the killings. José had been shot point-blank in the head. Kitty had been shot multiple times, even after she had collapsed. This wasn't a random crime, it was personal. Detectives knew it, even if they didn't yet have the proof. While suspicion grew, the brothers tried to carry on as if nothing was wrong. They threw themselves into their new lifestyle. Lyle appeared confident, strutting in designer suits, talking about business ventures. Erik, on the other hand, was more fragile. He struggled to maintain composure, especially around friends. He confided in some that he felt guilty, that he feared what might happen. The turning point came when Erik began therapy with Dr. Jerome Oziel, a Beverly Hills psychologist. Nervous and burdened, Erik confessed the truth: he and his brother had killed their parents. Oziel, stunned, kept tapes of their sessions. But the story didn't stay in his office. His lover, Judalyn Smith, discovered the tapes and, fearing for her own safety, later went to the police. Those tapes would become the linchpin of the case against the brothers. But at this point in the story, late 1989, the confession was still a secret, locked between Erik, his brother, and his therapist. Meanwhile, public sympathy for the brothers began to waver. Journalists questioned their spending habits. Friends noticed their extravagant behavior. Investigators quietly kept them on the radar, waiting for a mistake. And in truth, the brothers were making plenty of them. Their lies didn't always align, their alibis seemed shaky, and their emotions sometimes looked forced. At one point, Lyle even suggested to police that perhaps the killings were mob-related, a deflection that only deepened suspicion. Behind the walls of the mansion, now empty of their parents, the brothers lived without restraint. They invited friends over, threw parties, and basked in their new status. But as weeks turned into months, the weight of what they had done gnawed at them. Erik, especially, was haunted. Friends later recalled him breaking down in tears, unable to hold the secret. The guilt was written on his face, even as he tried to hide it with luxury and laughter. Lyle, more composed, tried to keep control, reminding his brother to stay strong. But the cracks were there, waiting to split wide open. Detectives, meanwhile, kept circling back to one conclusion: everything pointed inward. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables taken. No enemies of José or Kitty who had a reason to carry out such a brutal killing. The only people who stood to gain were the ones crying the loudest at the funeral, their sons. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. The police needed evidence, and until they had it, the brothers were free to keep playing their roles. And play them they did. They moved about Beverly Hills as if untouchable, their wealth cushioning them from immediate consequences. But whispers followed them. Journalists began to dig. The public, once sympathetic, began to question. How could two young men, devastated by tragedy, live with such extravagance? How could they smile, shop, and splurge when the blood of their parents had barely dried? These questions lingered, fueling gossip columns and dinner table conversations. Something didn't add up, and everyone could feel it. By early 1990, the storm was gathering. Erik's therapy sessions loomed like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode into the public eye. Lyle's arrogance grew, and with it, his visibility. The brothers were no longer just grieving sons, they were suspects, even if not yet formally charged. And for detectives, the case was becoming clearer: the Menendez brothers weren't victims. They were liars. Their lies were painted in Rolexes, stitched into Italian suits, and parked in the driveway in the form of a Porsche. Their lies were loud, flamboyant, and impossible to ignore. The illusion of innocence was cracking. And soon, the truth would break wide open, on national television, in one of the most sensational trials America had ever seen. By 1990, whispers had become headlines. The Menendez brothers were no longer seen as grieving sons but as prime suspects in the brutal murder of their parents. When detectives finally had what they needed, the confessions from Erik's therapy sessions, they made their move. In March of 1990, Lyle Menendez was arrested outside his Beverly Hills home. He had just returned from a shopping trip, still living the high life, when police put him in handcuffs. Erik, who was away playing tennis tournaments overseas, heard of his brother's arrest and quickly surrendered. The story instantly became front-page news. Two privileged young men from Beverly Hills, accused of slaughtering their own parents. It was a scandal made for the media. From the start, the case was sensational. Every detail of their lives was picked apart by reporters. Their shopping sprees, their designer suits, their lavish tastes, all became symbols of greed. Prosecutors painted a clear picture: the brothers killed José and Kitty for money. With their father gone, they would inherit millions and live without restraint. It was, to the prosecution, a textbook case of murder for profit. But when the trial opened in 1993, the defense unveiled a very different narrative, one that would divide America for years to come. Inside the Los Angeles courtroom, cameras were rolling. This was one of the first major trials to be televised in full, and millions tuned in daily. What they saw wasn't just a legal battle, it was a drama, filled with tears, rage, and shocking allegations. The brothers, sitting side by side in dark suits, looked less like killers and more like frightened young men. And as their lawyers spoke, the story took a shocking turn. The defense didn't deny that Lyle and Erik had pulled the triggers. Instead, they argued why. They claimed the brothers had lived under years of unimaginable abuse, emotional, physical, and sexual, at the hands of their father. José Menendez, they said, was not the successful, charming patriarch the world believed him to be. Behind closed doors, he was a tyrant. He controlled every aspect of his sons' lives, and, according to the brothers, he also violated them in the worst ways imaginable. Kitty, meanwhile, was portrayed as unstable, addicted to pills and alcohol, and unwilling, or unable, to protect them. The murders, the defense argued, were not motivated by greed but by desperation. The boys believed their lives were in danger, that their father would never let them escape his control. The testimony was gut-wrenching. Erik, in particular, broke down on the stand as he described the alleged abuse. His voice cracked, tears streamed down his face, and millions watching at home leaned in closer. He claimed his father had molested him since childhood, that he lived in constant terror, and that telling the truth would mean death. Lyle, too, spoke with fury and pain, describing years of fear and humiliation. Their words divided the nation. Some viewers believed them wholeheartedly, seeing two broken young men finally telling the truth. Others saw manipulation, a desperate attempt to escape accountability by painting their parents as monsters. The prosecution fought back fiercely. They argued that the abuse claims were exaggerated, if not fabricated entirely. Their case was simple: the brothers killed for money. They pointed to the spending spree after the murders, the Rolex watches, the Porsche, the restaurant. They reminded jurors that the boys had carefully planned the crime, buying the shotguns days in advance, and crafting an alibi at the movie theater. This was no spontaneous act of self-defense, it was cold-blooded murder, carried out to secure their inheritance. The courtroom became a battleground of emotion versus evidence. On one side, the defense showed the trembling voices of the brothers, the image of two boys trapped in a nightmare. On the other, the prosecution highlighted their greed, their lies, and their meticulous planning. The public was equally torn. Talk shows debated the case daily. Headlines screamed about the Beverly Hills killers. For many, the trial wasn't just about two brothers, it was about privilege, abuse, and justice in America. After months of testimony, the first trial ended in a stunning twist, a hung jury. Some jurors believed the brothers, convinced they had acted out of fear. Others sided with the prosecution, certain it was about money. With no verdict, the case dragged on. The brothers remained behind bars, awaiting their fate. And the nation remained divided, glued to their screens, watching every development. The Menendez trial marked the dawn of the true crime television era. For the first time, Americans could watch a murder trial unfold live, day after day. It became less about evidence and more about spectacle. Viewers debated at dinner tables, co-workers argued in offices, and talk radio buzzed with theories. Were Lyle and Erik victims of horrific abuse, or spoiled rich kids who murdered for greed? There was no middle ground. The phrase, trial of the century, is often overused. But in the case of the Menendez brothers, it was fitting. This trial wasn't just about who pulled the trigger. It was about the meaning of family, the reality of abuse, the power of money, and the blurred line between victim and killer. And as the cameras turned off after that first mistrial, the story was far from over. In fact, the most decisive chapter was still to come. When the first Menendez trial ended in a hung jury in 1993, the world was left stunned. For months, millions had followed every tear, every outburst, every allegation of abuse. Some believed the brothers were victims of unimaginable horrors. Others saw them as manipulators, exploiting public sympathy to mask their greed. The mistrial gave both camps fuel. But for prosecutors, it was unfinished business. They were determined to try again, this time with stricter rules and sharper focus. The second trial began in 1995, and from the outset, it was clear the tone had changed. Cameras were banned. There would be no televised spectacle, no daily feed for curious viewers at home. The judge imposed tighter restrictions on what the jury could hear, particularly about the alleged sexual abuse. Where the first trial had unfolded like a soap opera, full of emotion and tears, the second was colder, sharper, and more clinical. The prosecution had learned from their missteps, and this time, they were ready. The brothers, now in their mid-20s, sat once again in court, dressed neatly in suits. But without the daily television coverage, they no longer held the public stage. The story was still front-page news, but it lacked the raw drama that had once made it a household obsession. This time, it wasn't about spectacle, it was about facts. And the facts, prosecutors argued, were damning. They pointed again to the planning, the purchase of the shotguns days before the murders, the alibi at the movie theater, the precision with which the killings were carried out. They emphasized the aftermath, the shopping sprees, the Rolex watches, the Porsche Carrera, the restaurant investment, the $700,000 burned through in less than 6 months. And they reminded the jury of the brutality of the murders. José shot point blank in the head. Kitty crawling, screaming, shot repeatedly until her body could take no more. This, they said, was not desperation. This was execution. The defense tried to fight back, but they were hamstrung. The claims of long-term sexual abuse, which had carried so much weight in the first trial, were heavily restricted. The jury was told they could not consider abuse as a legal justification for murder, only as background. Without the emotional testimony of Erik sobbing on the stand, the defense lost much of its power. They argued instead for manslaughter, suggesting the brothers acted out of fear. But the jury, stripped of the emotional context that had swayed many in the first trial, saw it differently. On March 20, 1996, the verdict finally came. After years of speculation, retrials, and media frenzy, the jury announced its decision: Lyle and Erik Menendez were guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom was silent as the words were read. The brothers sat motionless, their faces pale, their futures sealed. The prosecution had won. The defense had failed. And the Menendez brothers' story had taken its darkest turn yet. The sentencing followed swiftly. Both Lyle and Erik were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the judge and prosecutors, it was justice. For many in the public, it was closure. But for others, those who had believed the abuse allegations, it was a tragedy, a failure of the system to recognize the complexity of their lives. The nation remained divided, but the law had spoken. The brothers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. In the weeks after the conviction, the media frenzy slowly faded. Other stories took the spotlight. But the Menendez name lingered, a symbol of excess, privilege, and parricide. For years, they were portrayed as spoiled rich kids who murdered their parents for money. Their defense of abuse was often dismissed, their tears forgotten. What remained in the public memory was the Porsche, the Rolex, the greed. Inside prison walls, however, the story was different. The brothers were separated, sent to different facilities, and left to grapple with the reality of their sentences. Gone were the expensive suits, the fine dining, the illusions of wealth. In their place came prison uniforms, strict routines, and the monotony of life behind bars. For Lyle, the older brother, it was a test of endurance. For Erik, the younger, it was a descent into isolation and regret. They had lived under their father's control all their lives. Now, they would live under the control of the state, forever. And so, in 1996, the Menendez saga entered a new phase. The trial was over. The verdict was in. The brothers were no longer celebrities, no longer the subjects of daily headlines. They were inmates, serving life without parole, their story written into the history of American crime. But as the years ahead would show, the fascination with Lyle and Erik Menendez was far from finished. In fact, decades later, the world would once again hear their names echo through courtrooms and news headlines, proving that the shadow of that night in 1989 had never really faded. When the gavel fell in 1996, sentencing the Menendez brothers to life without parole, it seemed like the end of their story. The nation had watched them cry, confess, and argue for their lives. They had become household names, symbols of either victimhood or greed, depending on which side you believed. But once the cameras switched off, the Menendez brothers were no longer infamous figures in suits. They were inmates, two young men in their 20s, stripped of freedom, shipped off to state prisons where their lives would stretch on in monotony and regret. Life in prison was nothing like Beverly Hills. The Rolex watches, the Porsche, the fancy restaurants, those belonged to another lifetime. Now, their days were defined by rigid routines, concrete walls, and the constant tension of survival in a world where weakness was dangerous. Lyle adapted with a kind of stoic determination. He became active in inmate programs, took on a leadership role among fellow prisoners, and tried to build structure into the chaos. Erik, more sensitive, struggled. At times, he fell into despair, haunted by guilt, unable to shake the memories of that night and the weight of his parents' deaths. Yet prison didn't erase their humanity. Over the years, both brothers found ways to rebuild some sense of life. They pursued education, took part in counseling, and even built relationships. Lyle married twice while incarcerated, first to Anna Erickson, a former model, in 1996, though that marriage ended in divorce. Later, he married journalist Rebecca Sneed in 2003, a partnership that lasted. Erik, two found love. In 1999, he married Tammy Saccoman, who had reached out to him after watching coverage of the trial. In interviews, she described their relationship as deeply emotional, built on letters and visits, calling it proof that love can survive even behind prison walls. While the brothers tried to carve out stability, the outside world largely moved on. For years, the Menendez case faded from the headlines, remembered mostly as a shocking tabloid story of the early 1990s. But time has a way of reshaping narratives. As new generations discovered the case through documentaries, podcasts, and eventually streaming platforms, the question of abuse came roaring back. Were Lyle and Erik cold-blooded killers, or were they broken sons trapped in an impossible situation? Inside prison, the brothers became aware of this shift. For decades, they had lived in the shadow of their crime, labeled monsters. Now, letters from supporters arrived, petitions circulated, and their names trended online. In 2018, after more than 20 years apart, they were finally reunited at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. The moment was emotional. Two brothers who had faced the unthinkable together, separated for half a lifetime, were allowed once again to share meals, walk the yard, and talk face to face. Erik described it as overwhelming, like getting a piece of himself back. Lyle, ever the protective older brother, said simply that it felt like home. Their lives in prison remained structured, bound by rules, but the reunion gave them a renewed sense of strength. Together, they participated in programs, counseled other inmates, and lived quietly, away from the chaos that had defined their earlier years. By all accounts, they became model prisoners, respected by peers, committed to rehabilitation, and far removed from the reckless young men who had once blown through their inheritance in a frenzy of denial. Yet freedom was still out of reach. Life without parole meant exactly that. There was no light at the end of the tunnel. Still, new laws and shifting attitudes about youth offenders gave the brothers a glimmer of hope. Advocates argued that because they were so young at the time of the murders, their sentences deserved reconsideration. Meanwhile, the world's fascination only grew. The Menendez case, once a relic of 1990s true crime, became a symbol of larger questions. How does abuse shape behavior? Can trauma excuse violence? And what does justice look like in a family where love, fear, and hate are intertwined? These questions kept the brothers' story alive, decades after the last gunshot in that Beverly Hills den. For Lyle and Erik, those decades behind bars were not just punishment, but transformation. They were no longer the frightened young men who had sobbed on the witness stand. They were middle-aged men, hardened by prison life, but also softened by time, reflection, and the quiet acceptance of their fate. They still carried the weight of their crime, the guilt of what they had done, and the shadow of what they claimed to have endured. But they also carried something else, the knowledge that the world had not entirely forgotten them, and perhaps, just perhaps, it might one day forgive them. As the years rolled on, their story remained a paradox. In prison, they lived structured, almost ordinary lives. Outside, they were cultural icons, the subject of debates, TV shows, and endless fascination. They were killers and victims, monsters and martyrs, depending on who you asked. And as 2025 approached, with parole hearings on the horizon, the decades behind bars that had once seemed final began to look like just another chapter in a story that refused to end. For nearly 3 decades, the Menendez brothers' fate seemed sealed. Life without parole meant exactly that. They would live out their days behind prison walls, their names remembered only as a cautionary tale of greed and parricide. But in the 2020s, the ground beneath their story began to shift. Changing laws, new public sympathy, and the relentless march of time brought their case back into the spotlight. By 2025, Lyle and Erik Menendez were no longer just prisoners, they were once again front-page news. The catalyst came from California's evolving laws on youth offenders. Courts began to recognize that young people, even those guilty of terrible crimes, deserved a chance at parole because their brains and judgment were not yet fully developed. Lyle was 21 and Erik just 18 at the time of the murders. That age difference, which had once seemed insignificant, now mattered enormously. In May 2025, a judge resentenced them from life without parole to 50 years to life, making them immediately eligible for parole hearings. For the first time in nearly 30 years, freedom was not just a dream but a legal possibility. The news rippled across the nation. Supporters of the brothers, many of whom had been children themselves when the murders took place, saw it as justice long overdue. They argued that the brothers had already served decades, that they had become model prisoners, and that their allegations of abuse had to be weighed against their crime. Critics, however, were outraged. To them, this was nothing more than a loophole, a technicality that threatened to release two cold-blooded killers back into society. The battle lines were drawn once again, just as they had been in the 1990s. In August 2025, the parole hearings began. The brothers, now middle-aged men in their 50s, appeared before the parole board in separate sessions. Gone were the designer suits and defiant stares of the 1990s. Instead, they wore prison uniforms, their hair grayer, their faces lined with age and time. Yet when they spoke, the emotion was unmistakable. Erik, in particular, described the haunting memories of his father's abuse. His voice trembled as he recounted the fear that had defined his childhood. He admitted the killings were wrong, that nothing could undo what he and his brother had done, but he insisted they had believed their lives were in danger. He spoke about his decades in prison, his rehabilitation, his remorse. Lyle, too, addressed the board, his tone steadier, more controlled. He acknowledged the horror of their crime, admitted the pain they had caused, but asked the board to see not the reckless young men of 1989, but the changed men of 2025. The hearings drew massive media attention. Outside the prisons, reporters gathered, cameras rolled, and commentators debated endlessly. Social media buzzed with clips and reactions. Younger generations, especially those on TikTok and Netflix audiences who had rediscovered the case through dramatizations, rallied in support of the brothers. To them, the story wasn't about greed. It was about trauma. But for survivors of crime and victims' advocates, the idea of parole was outrageous. They reminded the public that José and Kitty had been brutally gunned down in their own home, that Kitty had crawled across the floor begging for her life, that nothing could excuse that level of violence. When the board returned its decision, the answer was devastating for the brothers. Both were denied parole. The board acknowledged their rehabilitation and remorse, but cited concerns, past disciplinary violations, including illicit cell phone use in prison, and lingering doubts about whether they truly accepted full responsibility. In the board's view, the risk was too great. The brothers would remain behind bars. Their next opportunity for parole would come in 3 years, though with good behavior, it could be shortened to 18 months. The denial hit hard, but it wasn't the end. Their legal team quickly announced plans to seek other avenues, clemency from the governor, appeals based on new evidence of abuse, and future hearings that might give them another chance. The brothers themselves remained composed, even hopeful. Decades behind bars had taught them patience. If they had waited 30 years for this moment, they could wait a few more. For the public, the parole hearings reignited old debates. Once again, America was divided. Were the Menendez brothers murderers who deserved to die in prison? Or were they broken sons who had finally told the truth about their father, and who deserved a second chance? The question seemed almost impossible to answer. Every argument for their release was met with an equally powerful argument against it. And every time the story resurfaced, it captured new audiences, ensuring the Menendez name would never fade. By the close of 2025, the brothers remained where they had been for most of their lives, in prison, together, waiting. Yet something fundamental had changed. Their case was no longer a closed chapter. It was an open question, a story still being written. Whether through parole, clemency, or legal appeals, the possibility of freedom hung in the air. And with every new documentary, every new article, every new TikTok clip, public sympathy seemed to grow. What makes the Menendez brothers' story so enduring is not just the crime itself, but the contradictions within it. They were victims and killers, privileged and broken, guilty and sympathetic. They lived the American dream and destroyed it in one night of violence. For 36 years, people have argued over what really drove them: greed, fear, or desperation. And as long as that question lingers, their story will continue to haunt. In the end, perhaps the Menendez case is less about answers than about reflection. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, abuse, wealth, and justice. It asks us whether a lifetime of punishment is enough, whether trauma can ever excuse violence, and whether two middle-aged men who once committed the unthinkable can ever be forgiven. As the brothers returned to their cells after the parole hearings, they carried the same fate they had lived with for decades. But beyond those prison walls, their story remained alive, a question mark in the history of American crime. And so the saga of Lyle and Erik Menendez continues, suspended between guilt and sympathy, justice and mercy, punishment and forgiveness.